Hey, welcome to the Draft Academy. My name is Mike, and in this video, I'm going to be teaching you how to use the T-Rex test library. T-Rex test is a testing library that you can use to easily test any of your code directly on the browser. So T-Rex test runs on the browser. You'll be able to debug and use the browser console to be able to see everything that your code is doing. You'll be able to test your code, and ultimately it'll just increase your ability to be able to work and be productive on the web. So what I have for this tutorial is a basic demo where we have these 4 functions, and I'm going to teach you how to write tests for them using T-Rex test. Now, the first thing that we need to do before we go ahead and start writing tests is we need to install and configure everything. So I'm going to show you one way of doing that. Now, all you need to know is that T-Rex test is going to run, like I said, on the browser. So any of your code that's running on the browser, you can run T-Rex test alongside of it. It's going to be attaching all sorts of things to like the window. So you're not going to be able to use it in a Node.js environment. It's only going to work in the browser. And I think personally, that's how I like to test, because when you test code in the browser that's running in the browser, it's the same environment. So it tends to kind of reflect the reality of what you're doing a little bit better. So the first thing that we need to do is set up an empty folder. Now I just have this folder called T-Rex test demo set up, and then I have these 4 functions here that we're going to look at how to test. So we'll look at these in more detail. But then what we need to do is initialize this folder as an npm project. So in your console or your terminal, you can just go into the folder and you're going to type npm init. And then you're just going to, whatever you want to do for any of these options, I'm just going to leave all of them blank. But this is going to initialize the repository as an npm package or an npm module. So you're going to get this package.json file. And then in here, we're going to install a couple of dev dependencies. The first one is going to be T-Rex test. So you can say T-Rex test, and I'm going to make this a dev dependency. So I'm putting /-d. And then we're also going to install the something that we can use to run all of our code on the web. So in my case, I'm going to use Vite. So Vite is just like a web runner. It's going to allow us to kind of automatically run and develop all these things that we need on the web. So those are going to be added as 2 dev dependencies. And then what we need to do is add in a command for running this. So you can put this in the test command, or you can just put this as like a dev command. It doesn't really matter which one you do. T-Rex test is going to be run as you're developing your code. So why don't we add this as a dev command, but we could easily add this as the test command as well. And I'm just going to say Vite here. So Vite, like I said, it's a web runner. So it's going to essentially take like an index.html file and it'll run it. And then anytime we change anything, it'll like reload all the packages and all that stuff. So over here, let's create a new file. We're just going to call it index.html. And I'm just going to give this an HTML5 basic layout. And then down here, we're going to add a script tag, and you're going to say type is module, and source is going to be equal to index.test.js. So over here, I have this index.js file. This has all of our code. And then T-Rex test, we're going to add an index.test.js file, and this is where we'll store all of our tests. Now, the naming convention doesn't matter. Like, you don't need to have this named as .test.js, but it's a good convention. Now, another thing you might want to do, and I'm not going to do it here, but if you have code that you're like running alongside of this, you would want to put index.js here as well. And then when you want to run the tests or not run the tests, you could just comment this out. In this case, though, we're just going to be doing the tests just for this demo, but I do want to make that clear where you can have your test code here, and then you can have your actual like, you know, index.js, your actual like app code. And then whenever you want to test, you can just either comment this out or leave it open. Okay. So now we're going to go into index.test.js and let's start writing some code. The first thing we'll do is import T-Rex test. Now, T-Rex test is going to add a bunch of stuff onto the window. So the window is essentially like the global object or the global namespace in JavaScript. And that's where we're going to get a bunch of different variables and things that we can use, like functions. So down here in my terminal, we're just going to say npm run dev. So that was that Vite command. And then in here, we're going to, so once again, in our index.html file, we had index.test.js. And then in here, we're importing T-Rex test. So T-Rex test is going to give you access to a couple of globals, like I said. The first is called use tests. And this is sort of like the entry point for whenever you want to write a test. So in this case, why don't we just write one and it can just say example. And then this is going to take a function after it. This is pretty common for testing frameworks. So we have the name of the test that we want to run. This is like a test suite. And then we have a function, which it can just be an arrow function. And then in here, we're going to put individual cases. So I can say it works, for example. So this use test is like a test suite. It's going to contain all of our tests, and then it works in here. And then what we can do is we can assert something. So I could say assert, and this is just going to be a Boolean. So I could say like 5 is greater than 3, and then I can add a message, 5 is greater than 3, just like that. And then what this should do then is show up over here on the console. So Vite's telling me that it's hosting my web app at localhost 5173. That's just this. And then you'll see here that this little tests icon shows up. If we come down here, we can see there's an example, it works, and 5 is greater than 3. So this message over here, whatever you put there, that's going to show up over here underneath the works. We could also console.log. So if I console.log hello world, you'll see that that shows up down there as well. So anytime you console log, it'll show up automatically inside of these little drop downs. We can also add multiple. So we could say it works again. This would just be like another test. So inside of this use test, you can have as many of these as you want. And then we could make another assertion, like we could say 5 plus 3 is equal to 8. And then in this case, I won't add a message, but you'll see that now example has 2 out of 2 tests, and this one is passing. So this is basically how it works. And we have use tests. We have all of these it statements in here. Another thing that we can also do is add things before or before each. So I could say here, and these are just globals, you can call the before function and you can pass it an arrow function, and then anything that's in here is going to run before everything. So I could say console.log running before everything. And then another thing you can do is add in a before each. And down here you could say running before each it. So let's see what happens. You'll see up here it says running before everything. That ran before each one of these. And then down here, running before it, or running before each it. Yeah. So it runs before each one of them. And this is kind of useful if you have things that you need to like clean up, or if you have things that you need to set up before each one of these or before all of them, then you can do that. Another thing you can do is say after, and then you can say after each. And now it'll be the same thing kind of, except now in this case, the logging just got a little wonky. And so actually the reason that we're getting this being printed up here is just because of the way that T-Rex test schedules all the tests. So this is still technically running after all that stuff. It's just T-Rex test captures like the console logs and everything. So essentially though, those are the 2 or the 4 basic things. So after each, before, and then before each. All right, so now that we've taken a look at how this works basically, why don't we take a look at testing an actual piece of code? So this is generally how you'll have things structured, is you'll be having T-Rex test running alongside of all your other code in like an index.html file or wherever you're running it on the browser. And then generally, if you're going to be shipping the code, you don't want to ship the tests, or you don't want the test to have to run. So then you would just comment it out. But in this case, we have index.js, which has a bunch of code in it. And then we're just going to be testing it inside of our test file, just because I'm just teaching it. All right, so let's take a look then at index.js. We have the greet function. So why don't we write a test for that? We're just going to test and then assert that it returns the right thing. So over here, I'm just going to import that code, and that's generally what you'll do. So you'll import T-Rex test, and then you'll import whatever code you want to run. So we can import the greet method, and that's going to be from index. All right, so now we have greet, and oh, sorry, we need to do index.js. We might need to do a relative path too. Yeah, okay, so that looks good. So then in here, instead of testing all of this stuff, why don't we test the greet method? So generally with the use test, you'll put the name of the method or the function that you want to test, and then we can just say it returns the correct greeting. So you'll see here, like, T-Rex test can also be used as a way of sort of documenting your code. So the greet method should return the correct greeting, and then in here we're just going to call it, so we'll say const result is equal to greet, and why don't we say my name, so we'll greet me, and then I'm going to assert that the result is equal to, and let's just see what the function does again. So it just says hello with the name, so it should be hello Mike. All right, so let's run that test now. It looks like it failed. Now one of the cool things that we can do here is just debug within the console, so I can check to see what the result actually was, and you'll see we missed that comma. So we'll put the comma there, and then we can get rid of the console log, and then we should have the right test. So that's one of the benefits of running the tests alongside of the code, is that we can actually see with the console logs like what the result is in the environment that it's being run. Okay, so that's good for the greet method. And now let's move on to the next one, which is this classify age. So we'll go ahead and import that. And I'm going to be able to show you here how we can write multiple tests. So we'll just copy this so we can get the same structure. Classify age, and then in here there's a bunch of different paths, right? So if the age is less than 0, it's invalid. Why don't we start by testing that? So invalid age. And here we're going to have a bunch of these different a bunch of these different test cases. So it's just returning a string. So we can say here result is equal to classify age. And then why don't we put something that's less than 0, so like -1. And then we want the result to be invalid. Cool. Now, one of the things you'll notice first of all is that we have to kind of come down here and like click through all of these. So in T-Rex test, what we can do is sort of filter out which tests are being run. So in this case, it's running both greet and classify age. If I want it to just run classify age, I can just put a space before the age, or sorry, a space before the name. And what that space means is that it's only gonna run this test right here. And actually there's some more rules that we can get into with that in terms of how we filter these out. But this means that we want to run this one kind of like and skip all the other ones. So down here, now we're just running this classify age. So then let's go down. If they're less than 13, then they're a child. So we'll copy this. So child. And then here we can test, like if we put it as 8, now they should say they're a child. Cool. So now we're running invalid age and child. Let's do another one. So we can do teenager, which would be less than 20. And here, why don't we just put like 14? So this would be teenager. Cool. So now we have a few of these that are being run. Why don't we do one more, which would be adult, which is less than 65. And so this is a lot of times what you'll have is you'll have multiple test cases for the same kind of function. And then that, let's just put like, I don't know, 50. Cool. Now, another thing that we can do in terms of filtering, like I said, is over here, I put a space in front of this one. If I was to put another space in front of invalid age, now you'll see that we only run invalid age. If I put a space in front of child, now we run invalid age and child. So in this case too, if I put a space in front of greet, now we would run greet and classify age, invalid age, and child. So anytime you put a space in front of it, it means that that one is going to get run, and then anything that doesn't have a space in front of it isn't. Another thing that you can do is you can put two spaces, and if you put 2 spaces, then it'll just run that one. So in this case, even though these ones have a space in front of them, because I put 2 spaces in front of invalid age, that's the only one that gets run. If I did that to another one, like to teenager, you can see that it only would run the first one that has 2 spaces, okay? Another thing that you can do is skip some of these. So I'm gonna get rid of these spaces here. And if I wanted to skip one, I can put 3 spaces. So if we wanted to skip child, you put 3 spaces in front of the name, and then you'll see that we no longer run child. So this is a really easy way of being able to filter out which tests you want to run. You know, if like, for example, let's say that this child test was failing, right? So I put 90 here. So this child test is failing. If I wanted to just like hone in on this one test and forget about everything else, I could just put 2 spaces, or I could put 1 space, but then it would still, you know, it still might run the other ones. So you can kind of like filter in exactly what you want to do really quickly, and then that'll also be checked into your version control as well. So it's kind of like a nice way of being able to categorize the tests. All right, so now we can move on. We've done classify age, and you'll see here I'm getting rid of the space. So now we run everything, and it just kind of like has all of these folded up. The next function is the fetch data function. So one of the things you'll notice about fetch data is that it's an async function. Essentially what it does is it just waits like 100 milliseconds and then returns like this little object that has like item and ID. So with fetch data, we need to not only have an async function, but we're also going to have to wait for it to finish. So I'll show you guys how that works. Let's import fetch data. And then down here, we'll have some tests for that. So out of the box, T-Rex test supports async functions. So fetch data here, we could say like fetches the correct data. And all you have to do is make this an async function. So the function that gets passed as the second argument to the it, as long as that's async, then you'll be able to, you know, do whatever you need to do with async. And T-Rex tests are like the scheduler works, so it'll wait for the asyncs and it'll kind of handle all that in the background for you. So here we're just looking for an object, and we pass in the ID, and then it just has item plus ID. So actually, the cool thing too is we could just say like fetch data, and then why don't we put an ID in here of 1. Then I can just console log, because I'm not exactly sure like what we're going to get back from this, right? I can just console log the result, and you'll see we get a promise. So we need to await this. And then we get this item 1 back. So down here, then you'll see, so another thing that T-Rex test has is the ability to match objects, right? So I could say result, and you'll see we have an object here, result.matches, and then we can match it with this ID. So if it's an ID of 1, and then it has a name, which is item 1. And so I'm actually gonna filter this one so we can run it. And you'll see here, not only were we able to print it out, but we're also able to check to see that result matches this object. So this is something that's put on the prototype of the result function. So, or sorry, of the object itself. So matches is just gonna come like you'll get that out of the box with T-Rex test. But that's a really good way if we're checking for objects. And then you can see here we awaited the fetch data. Another thing you can do with async is you could await sleep. So there's this sleep method, and it doesn't want to write that down, but I could sleep for like 2,000 milliseconds and await that. And you'll see here, after 2 seconds, it runs the test and passes. So sometimes, you know, if you need to wait a certain amount of time, like then you can just do this sleep, and that's built right into T-Rex test as well. All right, so then the last thing that we're gonna do is take a look at this log user login, and I'm gonna tell you about spying. So spying is going to allow you to kind of spy on a function. So let's do that one, log user login. And then down here, we're going to put the log user login. And this is generally how you'll have your test cases, is just sort of like stacked up like that for the file. And then here we'll say calls the logger function. So let's just take a look at this little function here. You pass in a logger function, and then you pass in a user ID, and it just like creates this date and then logs out the user ID at that time. Okay, So again, one of the things that we can do is we could just say const result is equal to, so here we can say log user login, and I'm actually going to get rid of this down here. But we want to check to make sure that the logger gets called. So if I pass in just like a, custom logger, here I pass in an ID, I could create a variable like called I. If I set it equal to 0, down here I could say I++, and then here I could assert that I is equal to 1. So what this would do is, and why don't we filter this one out? What this will do is it'll check to make sure that this function here got called by just incrementing a value. Another thing that we could do is create an object here called object is equal to, and then we could put the logger inside of it, and then I can create a spy on that. So I could say object.logger, and then down here I could say use spy, and we could say object, and then over here the name of the key, and then we could do something similar. So here I would say I++, and we'd have our I equal to 0. And then this would sort of like automatically do the same thing. So then I could pass in object.logger, and whoops, instead of putting logger here, we would just put like whatever this is. So use spy is something that's built into, whoops, it's built into T-Rex test. So it'll automatically do that. And then what we could do, this will give you like an undo function back. So then after the test, you could just say undo, and that'll make it so it's not spying on it anymore. So essentially, anytime you have a object that has a function on it, you can spy on that object using this use spy method, and then it'll give you an undo, which would sort of remove the spy after the test is done. Okay, but otherwise, I think that does it for all of these functions. As you can see, T-Rex test is useful not just for writing tests, but also for documenting your code. Like if I read through this, you can see like we greet, with the greet function, it returns the correct greeting. With classify age, an invalid age would be one that's like -1. A child would be one that's like 3, etc. So not only is it helping you to write tests for your code, but it's also helping you to document your code. It works with async, it works for spying on functions, and it works primarily in the browser. That's the beautiful thing. So once again, T-Rex test, you could run it right alongside of any of your other code in the browser. You just need to make sure that when you ship that code into production, or if you want to kind of deploy that code or minify it, you want to just comment it out. And that way it's not kind of in the way. Another thing too, though, is you could have a dedicated like test environment where you just run all the test things. And I definitely recommend using a .test.js or whatever it is extension for all the code that's going to be testing. You want to make a clear separation between the actual source code and the actual testing code itself. But otherwise, I think that's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe. And otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.